much for the ontological.
Yes, right, that's the ontological argument.
Now, how about the other ones?
Well, here's one I like. People think, I think psychologically this is quite important to people. That's why this argument is probably more important psychologically. People think, without God, life is meaningless. Where is meaning? Right? It's just an empty charade of, you know, pointless and purposeless, valueless, going from one thing to the next. Well, the first reply to make to that is you don't necessarily need to seek the meaning of life outside of life. Here's the premise, the assumption of that argument. Without there being a being outside of human life would have no meaning. So the meaning of human life must be conferred by another being. Here's my question. What gives the meaning to that being's life? Right? How does his life, God's life, derive meaning? Well, here's a dilemma, right? Either God's life has meaning intrinsically just by his existence, or not, right? Well, if it does, then it's possible to have a meaningful life intrinsically. So why can't our lives have intrinsic meaning? They don't need to have their meaning conferred by another being.
But the religious might want to argue, without even reverting to the ontological proof of the existence of God, that the observable fact that we do have values and meanings is in fact evidence of the fact that something has given the meanings, in the same way that the argument from design says something has given the thing design.
Yeah. Well, I think there are 2 points there. One point is that the existence of values itself is an argument for the existence of God, like an evidence argument. Another point, though, altogether, is the idea that morality can only have a foundation if it's based on God's commands or God's desires, God's wishes. Right, now you started with the first one, of course. The thing to say about that is there's just no reason to think that the existence of values in human society depends on the existence of God. I mean, why should it? There's just no clear logical argument for one thing. Any more than the existence of ears, you know, is a reason. I mean, there are various aspects of human life. There's art, there's value, there's family, there's all sorts of things that we take to be valuable. Why does any of these require that we postulate God to explain their existence? A more worrying question for many people is they don't see that morality can have any foundation, can have any absoluteness, unless there's a God to certify it, legitimate it. You can see that point. It's a point that was discussed by Plato long ago in the euthyphro argument. And he makes, what I think Socrates makes, a completely compelling case, a refutation of that argument. And it simply goes as follows. The argument, you see, goes like this. So, suppose you take as a moral principle, it's wrong to steal. People say, now, why is that wrong? Why is it wrong to steal? Answer, because God says it's wrong to steal. God commanded that you should not steal. Okay. The point that Socrates makes in that dialogue is to say, well, how can God give this moral rule a foundation? Either the moral rule is itself intrinsically a sound moral rule, or it can't be given soundness and legitimacy from an external command. Suppose, for example, we had the rule, it's right to murder. And somebody said, that's not right. Murder is wrong. And somebody said in reply, but God says it's right to murder. That doesn't convince you that it's right to murder. If God says that something is right which isn't right, God's wrong. Right? He can't make something right just by saying it's right. What God has to do is reflect what's right in his commandments. So that's what he really does. It is wrong to steal, wrong to steal and wrong to murder. So God says that it's wrong, and he's right to say that. Why? Because it is wrong in the two cases. He doesn't make it wrong by saying it. He can't do that. If that was so, we'd have no reason to respect God's morality.
In that case, God, as it were, appropriates our spontaneous and indigenous values, which then get, as it were, reflected back upon this hypothetical entity, which then seems to validate our beliefs.
Exactly. So we don't need God to validate our moral beliefs. He couldn't validate them. His validations only work in as much as they correspond to what is morally right and is morally wrong. He can't make something be morally right when it's not. Another way to put it is, it can't be a matter of God's free decision or whim what's right and wrong. People can see that morality is what it is. They know what they ought to do. But human beings are weak. We're weak. We have weakness of the will. We don't always do what we know very well we ought to do. And that is, in most people, produces the phenomenon of guilt. Guilt is a powerful negative force in people's minds. People hate guilt. Right? Guilt is a bad feeling. So you need something to prevent guilt. To prevent guilt, you need something to make you do what you know is right. But since human beings are weak, they don't always do what they know is right. But God gives you an extra motive to do what's right, beyond morality itself. Morality gives you a motive, but it's a motive which is rather fragile, rather, momentary, intermittent, and easily broken. But if you've got the idea of God there, it can sort of give it some more oomph, gives it more power. And then you can do what you know is right more easily, more regularly, and that's perfectly sensible. That's why it's reasonable. It's not unreasonable anyway for an atheist to think that maybe we need God or people need God, because without God they can't do what they know is right. And I don't believe that myself. I think people are not as morally depraved as the religious tradition says. I think most people will do what's right in normal conditions. They won't always, of course, but normally they will. They don't need God. And I think people who sometimes have lived with God as their moral support, their moral whatever it is that they're getting from it, when they cease to believe in God, they feel that it was not as difficult to be moral afterwards as they suspected it might be. And in fact, it was better, because there's a corrupting part to that conception of God, which is the idea that you're doing something good because God will reward you and think well of you. And that's a corrupting idea. It's much better to do what's good because it's good, and only because it's good. And that's your only reason for doing it. But the idea you're going to get the warm, fuzzy feeling, oh, God's really pleased with me today, I did this, that's not what morality ought to be about.